Hello, and welcome to today's DevTalk with our Zebra developer expert, Darren Campbell. We're going to be getting started in just a couple of minutes here, so I'm just going to have everybody on hold, and we'll start promptly at 10 a.m. Thank you. Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's DevTalk, getting started developing for Zebra Android devices. We're going back to the basics today with Darren Campbell, our resident expert. I just wanted to go over a couple of things for you here on our opening screen. If you are not part of our developer community, please feel free to join us. It is a free community to join. Things like this DevTalk and blogs and technical documentation, etc., will be provided on that developer portal, and we encourage you to join at your earliest convenience. As far as today and how we're going to run this session, we'll go ahead and let Darren go through his presentation. We'll be taking questions at the end, so if you do have a question during the presentation, feel free to go ahead and type that in the chat box, and then I'll go ahead and announce your question at the end here and let Darren respond to you. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Darren, and thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you, Stacey. Yeah, so this is going to be more of an introductory session on developing for Zebra Android devices. If I just get to the first slide here, there's a common question we get on the community often is like, where do I start? We do have an awful lot of resources available, so I thought it made sense to spend half an hour putting together this content to sort of point people to say, hey, this is a good place to start developing for our devices. We're going to run through actually gathering data from the barcode scanner, which is about 95% of our customer use cases. Probably spend about 20 minutes on that, and then the final tail end, maybe 10 minutes of the presentation, go over some of the areas which you also need to consider as an application developer in enterprise, and certainly some of the things that have changed over the past 3 or 4 years since we last put one of these presentations together. And developer tools and SDKs, like I say, is going to be the primary focus of this presentation, but not the be-all and end-all. So what are Zebra Android devices? If you're not already familiar, then we have a wide range of devices available in all sorts of different form factors, from kiosks at the top right there, that's our newest CC6000, I think it is, down to tablets at the bottom. We have form factors for transport and logistics and retail in the bottom left down there. We have warehouse devices in the top left and the center top as well. Personal shopper devices on the right. And all of these devices are running what we call the common platform. So in theory, you should be able to create any application for one of our devices, and then it should run without trouble or modification on any of the other devices, taking into account things like screen size and hardware differences, like maybe some of the devices have got GPS and some haven't. But we tried to make the actual development experience as friction-free as possible. You'll be developing for our devices in the same way as you currently develop for consumer devices, like you'll be using your IDE of choice, your framework of choice, and we offer SDKs, tools, and utilities to enable development, and that's kind of what we're going to be going through in this presentation today. So the landing page for all of our technical documentation, from samples to APIs to SDK information, guides, tutorials, is TechDocs. It's techdocs.zebra.com, and there's quite a lot of content here, and it's this page where people normally hit, and the first question is, well, where do I go for Android application development? It's not too obvious to some people, and maybe you'll see EMDK for Android there, and that's where most people hone in on. That is incidentally our SDK for Android. But even though we have a lot of tiles on that page, the 3 or 4 tiles which really concern Android app development are the 2 at the bottom there. That's our EMDK, that's the software development kit, and we have variants both for Android and for Xamarin. And we also have a tool that we call DataEdge, and that's the recommended way of developing for our devices. Over the past 3 or 4 years, our attitude has changed based on feedback that we've got from customers, and now we heavily push DataEdge as the most friction-free way of creating an application for one of our devices, and so that's where I'll be concentrating a lot of information in this presentation. I haven't actually called out Enterprise Browser here. If you're developing with JavaScript frameworks, or like you're creating a JavaScript application, then you may well use Enterprise Browser as your framework to deploy your applications. So if you launch into the EMDK for Android, in fact, if I just go back, this is the bottom 2 boxes on this slide here, EMDK for Android or for Xamarin. If you launch the SDK docs, you'll be given this big red shouty box, which is a little bit more red than I probably would have designed it, but essentially it's telling you that we don't recommend the EMDK as the primary development technique for new applications. Like, we recommend using DataEdge, and the reason for that is because over the past couple of years we've seen essentially people using the SDK have run into the same problems again and again and again, and we can give sample applications which show best practice. We can produce guides, recommendations, blog posts, but at the end of the day, people were still coming up these similar issues around control of the single scanner and handing the scanner instance off between applications, and we saw these issues again and again. And for that reason, we recommend using DataEdge, because DataEdge handles everything for you. It's a separate service running on the device which controls the scanner, worries about the threads and handles that you need to create, disabling the scanner when it needs to be disabled, applying the properties at the correct time in the scanner lifecycle when they're able to be applied, and it's just a lot easier to use the DataEdge tool to manage the scanner lifecycle. So DataEdge, like I say, is a service which runs on the device, and you can think of it as a pipeline where you have various inputs into DataEdge. And for example, the barcode scanner is the most used input, and they're called input plugins. And then there's an optional processing stage, what we call data formatting, that you perform on the data within the DataEdge service itself, and then how your application gets that data is defined through the output plugin. So input, format the data, output to your application. And all of those are defined in the DataEdge configuration, and we call this a profile. So the DataEdge profile contains all of the configuration on how you want the data to arrive at your application, how you want the data to be fed in to the device from the barcode scanner, the settings of the scan engine. Like, you might have, well, I think we actually support upwards of 200 different properties that you can set on the scanner, symbologies, whether you want to scan multiple barcodes at once, whether you have pick list enabled. All of those things are specified in the DataEdge profile. And then the DataEdge service is responsible for monitoring the foreground application in an efficient manner. And when your application comes to the foreground, it will apply all of the settings that you've defined in the DataEdge profile to the scanner to make sure that the scanner is going to behave correctly in when your application is in the foreground, as you would expect. And some of those settings will be how your application receives the data as well. So to make sure that it's always going to send data to the appropriate intent, for example, when your application is in the foreground. And so some of these plugins, just to list them all here. So the input plugins, barcode, I've emboldened the most frequently used of all of these options here. But for legacy reasons, we also support magstripe reading. RFID is becoming more popular. We currently support that with a single device, the MC33, and we are looking to roll that out to additional devices. Serial USB to interface with some legacy hardware and additional peripherals. And we're also exploring voice as another form of input. In terms of formatting, you only really do formatting if you're outputting keystrokes. So like back in the day when all applications were, like before Android, all applications were receiving their DataEdge data as keystrokes, it was a very common use case to want to modify the data before the keystrokes were injected into the application. Whereas nowadays, most applications tend to use Android intents to receive their data. We do still support keystrokes, but that's why we're seeing not as many applications do some kind of data formatting, because the application itself does the formatting after it receives the Android intent, rather than relying on DataEdge to format the data before sending it to the app. So just a very brief demonstration on exactly how you go about configuring DataEdge, just to show that the DataEdge service is present on the device, some of the input plugins, and this demo is actually going to configure the CAN postal decoder, which is specifically for Canadian Postal Service. I think it just happened to be, near the beginning of the alphabet is why I chose it, but you can extend this to, like, I think, like literally we have tens, if not about 100 different decoders that we support. So I'll just run through this very briefly and comment over it. So the DataEdge service is running on all of our devices. Those are the profiles available, and each profile is associated with an app, an activity and an app. Currently, this profile is associated with the calculator. I have also associated it with Chrome. I've made sure that the barcode input is enabled so that the scanner is going to be enabled whenever Chrome comes to the foreground, or the calculator, and it's going to recognize Canadian postal barcodes. You see, I just enabled that decoder. If I present the barcode with a Canadian postal barcode, I'm going to enable keystroke output, so my application is going to receive keystrokes just as though I was typing it on a keyboard. And then I'm also going to enable the intent output, so I can register a broadcast receiver. In this instance, I'm delivering the intent as a broadcast intent in my application, and then I will receive the data through my broadcast receiver. And at the very end of the demonstration there, I just showed how you could do some basic configuration or formatting of the data, although I didn't actually set up any rules and conditions, but that was the menu option for doing the data modification. So whenever Chrome now comes to the foreground, those settings are applied. DataEdge is clever enough to monitor that Chrome is in the foreground, and so I'm going to send data through both keystrokes and intents. Obviously, that example is a little bit constructed because you can't have Chrome handle custom intents, but the principle is there, hopefully. So that's DataEdge, how you gather data. And over the past couple of years, we've put a lot of effort into making DataEdge's capabilities in line with our native EMDK, the software development kit that we still offer. And the line that we now take is that everything that you can do with the EMDK, you can also do with DataEdge. And in order to allow that, we have exposed a DataEdge API. And so the purpose of this slide is to just show how DataEdge and the DataEdge API work together for data acquisition. So if you'll just bear with me, this was also me having a bit of fun with PowerPoint. So you have a device, in this instance is a TC51. And all of the devices that we have, this common platform that I spoke about earlier, have DataEdge installed upon them. You see I've circled it down here. So this particular device has DataEdge and the DataEdge service. This is going to handle the interaction with the barcode scanner as well as interact with our application. So the application is running on the device. This is an application that we want to add barcode scanning capabilities to with DataEdge. And so the application sits at the top of the stack. And the use case is going to be, we have a barcode and we want to scan that barcode by pressing the hardware trigger. And when we do so, the scanner beam emits, the barcode is scanned, and I receive a intent. Now this, I'm describing this here similar to how in the previous demonstration I configured an intent that got sent whenever a barcode is scanned. Well, this profile has been configured in the same way. The intent might be sent through start activity, send broadcast, or start service, and your application is going to receive that intent. Obviously, it needs to have created a broadcast receiver, or it needs to have a service which is ready and listening for the start service, which is invoked by DataEdge. So you need to make sure that your application is configured in line with the way that you've configured DataEdge to send the data. You know, it's going to receive the data that DataEdge sends. And then every time I scan a subsequent barcode by pressing the barcode scanner, the beam emits and I get another intent. So one intent for one barcode. It can get a little bit more complicated than that. We have like multi-barcode capabilities, but for now, one barcode, one intent. That's all very well and good, but there is a conspicuous big white square on the diagram. So let's fill that square in. This is where the DataEdge API is going to sit. And very deliberately, I'm keeping this separate from the intent plugin because although it's related, because it's all DataEdge, you can view the API as a separate entity unto itself. The API consists of a series of commands. Now, if you go to techdocs.zebra.com and to the DataEdge API section, you'll see them all listed there. There's an awful lot of them. We've got sample applications showing all of how to use them all. But one example of a command is the ability to start what we call a soft scan. And a soft scan essentially does the exact same as pressing the physical hardware trigger, but rather than have to touch the device, the scanning engine is behaving as though you've pressed the hardware trigger, but you've actually invoked it through the API. And this is particularly helpful. Like in this UI here, for example, we have a soft button here that I can press to invoke the scanner. And what that did behind the scenes was to call the start scan API, sorry. And yeah, the laser beam comes out without having pressed the hardware trigger. I get an intent, so the delivery mechanism is the same as I've delivered in my profile through the intent plugin. My application comes to know that I've scanned a barcode. So that's the simple mechanism of the DataEdge API, but there's still a conspicuous white box on the screen. We'll fill that in with the responses. So some of these commands that you send will cause DataEdge to respond back with some value. And I think the example that I've given here is to enumerate the scanners, because we have not just the front-facing two-dimensional imager as the scanner that we can use to capture data. We also have the camera on the back of the device on many of our hardware SKUs, but also DataEdge will natively support many of our Zebra Bluetooth scanners. Now, I do stress these are the Zebra Bluetooth scanners, but if you have things like the RS 507, 517, 6000, I think 6000 is the most recent one, or any of our DS lines, our dedicated scanners. That's not what DS stands for, but the standalone scanners that connect via Bluetooth from our scanning division, you can interface with those through DataEdge, and it makes it a lot easier if you were trying to do Bluetooth scanning using our EMDK. It's difficult because you have to manage the pairing and connection of the scanner. Like if it's not connected, then you need to make sure it's connected and prompt the user and blah, blah, blah. Whereas with DataEdge, it handles all of the pairing and connection for you, and it's again, one of the major pain points that we found for customers using the SDK, in that there'd be some edge case that wasn't considered, like the scanner would go out of range, and then things would go wrong in the app. There's another reason to rely on DataEdge. But I'm getting off track a little bit. If you enumerate the scanners with the enumerate API, then you receive back in your application an array of scanners, and this is through a broadcast intent only. So again, I've got a broadcast receiver in my application which is receiving information back from the DataEdge API, which comes from the DataEdge service. And to put all this together, there is an official sample on Zebra's GitHub. The link is at the top there, but you can get to these samples by going to techdocs.zebra.com, and then it's under DataEdge samples. It's going to create a profile, configure that scanner, I think it enables some of the decoders, and just to show you that those setting changes that you make through the API are reflected as part of the DataEdge service. So it's easier to show this rather than to talk through it beforehand, to be honest. So you'll see there are no profiles at the moment. And if I launch the sample app, I can click on that create button at the top, and that's going to invoke the DataEdge API to create the profile. And it's going to do what's called a set config when I hit that set button, which enabled the code 39, code 128, and a few other decoders, I think it was. Notice how this profile is now associated with the sample app. That's all handled through the UI. And if I go into the decoder settings of the created profile, you'll see that code 39 is enabled, code 128 is enabled, and if I were to scroll down the UPC-A, I think it was, and EN13 would also be enabled. I can disable those, and then when I hit set, that's going to invoke the DataEdge API, and I can go back to the DataEdge service. If I just scroll down, you'll notice that those decoders are now disabled. So rather than have to have modified them manually or deployed the profile, which is actually a database file which you can deploy to these devices, I don't have to do that. I can configure everything within the app myself. And then, of course, at the very end there, it did scan a barcode, but because I'm just capturing the screen, you didn't see the scanner come out. You just saw that the UI got reflected that I'd scanned an E13 barcode. So yeah, that's a demonstration of DataEdge. And then on the next slide, okay, so sorry, I got a little bit distracted there, but that's essentially everything that there is to know to get started using DataEdge. We have tutorials online, we have these sample apps. Please take a look. The API can do a lot more than what I've demonstrated here, but you know, it's as a starting point, this is pretty much all you need to do. And I don't know, 90% of people, this is all they really need to add to their application. Once you've configured the scanner one way, maybe you'll be disabling the laser beam on some activities in your app, so you'll be using the scanner input plugin API. That's a very common one, but this is pretty much most people's use cases here. So yeah, hopefully that's been useful. But in the last 10 minutes probably of this presentation, I just want to cover some other features that it's good to be aware of as you're developing enterprise applications. So the first one is considering the user experience. If you're more familiar with consumer app development, the goal is often to keep users engaged in the application for as long as possible. And you want to do that to maximize your ad revenue. And obviously that's against the enterprise idea where your application wants to be as functional and as useful as possible. And ideally you want the users to spend as little time in your app to accomplish a task as possible. So it has to be responsive, it has to be easy to use, and it has to not waste the user's time. And we have a whole division here at Zebra, a design team. They're actually based, well, they've got offices worldwide, but they're based out in London. I've been up to their offices a few times, and for most of their work is involved with hardware design. So they have received a number of awards for our great hardware design. But what I find most useful as a software developer, they put out a lot of information really concerning enterprise development for our sort of use cases. And personally, I'm really poor at making our apps look nice if I'm doing if I'm doing a sample app, then I find that icon repository. If you go to design.zebra.com, click on resources, you'll find that they make all of their icons available for you to consume within your enterprise app. This is just the tip of the iceberg. This is alert and AV, but you can scroll down to the bottom and you'll see there's all sort of barcode icons, and there's icons for the different verticals we've got, like transport and medical, hospitals. So yeah, feel free, please make use of these icons within your application. I strongly recommend it. And our devices exist in a number of environments that you don't necessarily find consumer devices operating in, areas where the operators might wear gloves, or they might be exposed to direct sunlight. And so there are some user design guidelines which differ slightly from the standard consumer guidelines. So what our team have done, they've taken Google's material design as the starting point, which is obviously a very good starting point to have, but then they have made other considerations and tweaks, maybe to the color scheme to make things more bright and obvious in a bright light scenario, or they've made the touch buttons of buttons bigger to accommodate these users who are wearing gloves, or who have sausage fingers, if my postman's anything to go by. And you'll see some of our applications over the coming months and years will be modify. As we update our apps, we'll conform to our internal design guidelines on these. And so you'll notice this is our device central application. The buttons are large, visible, bright, easy to see what a button is versus the background. And also at the bottom here, where I don't know what this is called, this bottom menu bar, but these are large icons. These are actually part of that icon set I was showing earlier on, and very large touch areas as well on all of these. So yeah, just user interface, often forgotten about by some developers, but integral to the experience of all of the best applications. That sounded good. I just made that up on the spot. Okay, so that was user experience. Another topic which has really changed a lot over the past 10 years almost. Like when I first started with mobile application development, it was back on the Windows Mobile, Windows CE days. And if you wanted to add some configuration to your application, you would probably use the Windows registry. And obviously, we don't have a Windows registry on Android. So we found a lot of people would migrate that experience to just having a configuration file on the SD card, well, the SD card as it was at the time, and now it's like the external mass storage directory. And each application would have its own format, its file format. Like some apps would use an XML file, some apps would use a JSON file, and I kid you not, I even had an application which was using an INI file, not my app, someone else's app at one point on Android, which I thought was quite funny. They must have been doing all their file handling in C or something, and just copy and pasting it from the old Windows Mobile implementation. But my point is, every application was doing its configuration in its own particular way. There wasn't any real security around those files that were just stored on the mass storage area. Every file was in a different format, and every file was in a different place as well, potentially. Like some might be in the root of the SD card, some might have to be in a particular folder off of it, some would be automatically consumed. It worked. You could push these files down from your EMM of choice, OT, AirWatch, Mobile Iron. They all supported writing files to world writable locations, and then the application, your application, could read those files in. It wasn't maintainable though for the administrator trying to control all of these applications and configure all of these applications on hundreds and thousands, tens of thousands of devices. And this is all a very long way of saying of the latest method for configuring your app is to use a technique called managed configurations, also known as application restrictions. There's more information from Google. This was originally and still is a Google technology, so it's not proprietary to Zebra. The way it works is, as a developer, you define your application configuration in a schema, which is just an XML file on your device. And then as you upload your app to Google Play, the schema is extracted and everything is in a known format. You define your config as either a Boolean value, and it has a description and it has a key, and it has maybe a choice of values that it can be if it's a multiple choice, or it might be a string. And because there's that semantic information available to the configuration, it can be presented to the administrator in the EMM console in a consistent manner. And then the EMM can configure your app and not have to worry about proprietary files, file structures, file formats, or proprietary, like where your application expects the file to be pushed to. It's also very well and good for the EMM administrator, but as a developer, it's just something you need to be aware of, because it's always good to expose your configuration through this managed configuration technique. Even if your organization isn't yet using managed configs, then the direction the industry is moving, and we're certainly seeing this in our customer base, is to adopt managed Android, and a part of managed Android is managed configurations. And then finally, in the same vein of thought, the shift towards managed Android has also precipitated a shift towards changing how applications are distributed. And again, take it back 3 or 4 years, applications were pushed, probably side-loaded onto our type of device. Maybe they were deployed with ADB. They were probably pushed to the device through an EMM in about half of cases, and then installed either through the package manager or through, we actually had an interface, a proprietary interface called MX install application, or application install. That's changing. We originally, we even had our own kind of Play Store, which we called the App Gallery, which worked on AOSP devices. But over the last couple of years, we've seen a really strong shift towards managed Android, and part of managed Android is the managed Play Store. And how this affects you as a developer is you're probably going to be deploying your application through the Play Store. Even in the enterprise, which is not something that I would have been saying a few years ago. And so in order to do that, you need to make sure you comply with Play Store policies around user safety, user privacy. They're all at that link. There's literally tens of them, if not more. And the crux of it is just don't do anything silly, honestly, but it's good to familiarize yourself with that policy. You need to target a recent API level, and you need to make sure that your application is not flagged as potentially harmful. Where this might trip some people up, like there are certain APIs and certain intents that you cannot use if you want to be in the Play Store. Like as an example, we had a customer who wanted to whitelist their application against doze mode. And there's actually an intent that you can send to whitelist your application. And so they were sending that intent, and that worked really well for a Play Store, for a side-loaded application. But if they tried to move to the Play Store, that intent was forbidden, and so they would have had a problem moving to the Play Store. Rather than go into detail, we do have a way around that. We do actually have a proprietary mechanism for avoiding avoiding doze mode. So we were able to help that particular customer, but as a principle, just make sure that everything you do in your application is compliant with that app later being uploaded to the Play Store. And the difference between the managed Play Store and the consumer Play Store is an organization has like a curated set of applications which they choose to install. If you're familiar with Android for Work or Android Enterprise, or whatever it's called now, where you have this work profile on your phone. I think it's called work profile actually. If you're familiar with that in your consumer phone, like Zebra, I think we use Intune as our EMM on our corporate personal phone so that our organization can push applications to our phone. The Play Store as part of that work profile is the same managed Play Store as you would find on our devices that are running managed Android, only like on your consumer phone, you have two sections. You have the personal section and you have the work profile, whereas on our devices, because they're single use, they're corporate owned single use devices, the expression is, then that managed Play Store controls the whole of the device. But the principle is the same. The user is able to only select applications which the administrator has whitelisted. The administrator can push those applications down to the device, and the curated list of apps can be a superset of those chosen from the public Play Store, and also those applications which have been uploaded to the organization in a private manner. So you can imagine, as a developer, your application might either have been put to the public Play Store, or you might be selling your application, or employed by a company to directly upload to their private organization. But either way, it's going through Google's Play Store mechanism, even if it's not private. And so that comes to a conclusion. I didn't want to spend more than 30 minutes on the content of this presentation, because it was really designed as an introduction and an overview, but this is the list of resources. So everything from tech docs at the top there to the DataEdge sample that I went through, and the DataEdge information, and some resources on our design team, managed configurations, and the managed Play Store. And so now I will flip back to this slide shortly, but I will open the panel. What am I doing? A webinar. I'll open the webinar up for questions at this point. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Darren. This is Stacy again. We have several questions, so I'm just going to go through these and answer these if you can. I am Alessandro from Italy. Do you think the porting of the EMDK functionality to Android intents will continue, or will EMDK always be the preferred instrument to interact with Zebra hardware?
So it's the other way around, actually. So the DataEdge is the preferred way of interacting with Zebra hardware. We say that if we add new functionality, we will add it to DataEdge first. We will prioritize DataEdge. We still support the EMDK. I'll stress this, there are absolutely no intentions to remove the EMDK from our tools portfolio. We recognize that there are customers who will not or cannot move away from the EMDK for whatever reason, but we will be prioritizing DataEdge as the way to interact with our devices. The one exception in terms of the parity between EMDK and DataEdge is Secure NFC. So if you're using the Secure NFC SDK, there's no intention to move Secure NFC to DataEdge, and that's because there's a performance reasons for doing so. We have to have that as a native SDK.
Okay, great. Let me get to the next one here. John asks, does it support NFC input?
So DataEdge does not support NFC. If you want NFC, obviously there's the Android NFC APIs, and I mentioned the Secure NFC that we offer as part of our EMDK, but no, there's no intention to add NFC to DataEdge.
Okay, and Henry has a couple of questions. The first being, we are currently using a farm of TC75s to automate our regression test. Can I test instead on the Android emulator or regular devices?
So you cannot with the EMDK, but with DataEdge, it is possible, depending on how you've configured your profiles. I did do a blog post about this probably about a year ago on our developer portal, developer.zebra.com, to plug that. So what you can do, if your application is expecting these intents to be sent from DataEdge whenever you do a barcode scan, you can simulate that with an ADB call, because it's essentially the same as sending an intent. You just have to make sure the intent is in the right format. So it is possible to test your application on the emulator if it's expecting input from DataEdge, but it's not possible to run DataEdge or to download DataEdge separately to the emulator. So I hope that makes sense.
Okay. Henry asks, does DataEdge work on Android 6 Marshmallow?
Yes, it does. If you look at the release notes for any of our Marshmallow releases, then I think essentially, as we update the operating system, the OS update, or we can update the lifeguard patch on the device, then you'll receive updates to DataEdge. But DataEdge has been part of the product ever since the very inception of Android. I remember we had DataEdge back on the ET1 that was running Gingerbread, so yes.
Okay, and Thomas, I can answer your question. Is the presentation available for download? We're going to actually have the presentation. We're recording this, so we'll have it up on YouTube, and also a hard copy of Darren's presentation available within the next week. So that's that one. The next one is from Luis. Any way to read RFID tags from FX9600 from Android with the EMDK? I'm having some issues with the SDK provided.
No, not unfortunately, and it's not an area I'm very familiar with. I know we have a separate SDK that you use to download, and it sounds like you found that. That's what you're having issues with. If you have any trouble, then the first thing you can do is to post a question on our developer.zebra.com community. If you don't get any response there, or there's no one there that can help you, obviously there is an escalation channel through our support organization. But no, there are no current plans to expose the RFID capabilities through either DataEdge or EMDK beyond what I mentioned earlier, that we support the MC33 RFID, and there are maybe we'll add extra handheld RFID scanners. I don't have any definitive plans on that, but there are absolutely no plans today to support the FX range of those fixed readers.
Okay. Alessandro asks again about OCR. So that was in reference to his back question.
Okay. OCR with reference to DataEdge or optical character recognition. We are working on a feature that has OCR capabilities, but that is being added to the low level. So that would be in both the EMDK and DataEdge, but it's not a released feature yet, and I don't have any commitments on when that would be released. But it is something we're working on, optical character recognition.
Okay. Eduardo asks, can DataEdge be integrated with Flutter?
I've not tried it, and I don't know. What I've done for other, so I've never tried it with Flutter, but with other frameworks, I ended up writing a native plugin that would handle generic intents. Like I did this for Cordova, Ionic, and React Native, because we got similar requests. And that native plugin would interact with DataEdge through intents and then talk to the Flutter, in this case, application. But to my knowledge, no one has done that. There might be a few third-party projects that are unrelated to Zebra that have done that work. I can't remember off the top of my head, but if you Google for Zebra Flutter, you might get some results, but nothing official has come out of Zebra for Flutter support, I'm afraid.
Okay, and he goes on further, a further question on this, or do we need to integrate with the SDK, EMDK with Flutter? So
the two choices would be to have a native Flutter component that interfaces with EMDK, or a native Flutter component that interfaces with DataEdge through intents. I'd personally recommend the latter, to interface with DataEdge, because obviously we're pushing DataEdge, but also it's a little bit of a gray area if you were to interface with the EMDK, because technically you're not allowed to distribute that. And I think if you were to try and include EMDK in your native Flutter package, then technically you're going against those distribution rules. But I'm guessing a little bit when I start talking about that. But yeah, either of those two options would be your choices.
Okay. Vince is asking, what version of Android Studio does the EMDK support?
So EMDK, the very latest version 7.4.1, supports Android Studio 3.5. So there's your answer. So the latest version. There will always be a gap between when Android Studio releases and then our team have to do some work potentially to get EMDK working. They do obviously look at the preview version of Android Studio to check for compatibility, but I know Android Studio 3.5 broke our plugin, so there was a few weeks where the plugin was sort of not available, and I was pushing the team to say, hey, we're getting a lot of complaints about this, guys, and we did release a fix for that. But just bear that in mind. If you are at the bleeding edge of Android Studio releases, then I can't always guarantee that our EMDK will work, but it should do. I think it's a rare occasion where something breaks, but obviously it has happened in the past.
Okay, and let me just get to this next one. Alessandro actually asked also if it seems that Simulscan will no longer be supported. Is that correct?
That is correct, but it's only correct in the most technical sense. The features are being moved around, and the capabilities are by and large remaining, but there are a few exceptions to that. So I don't really feel able to speak to the specifics of that, but yes, there are changes happening, but the changes aren't we're getting rid of it. It's just moving about a bit, and there are a few lesser used features that are being removed. I'm trying to be diplomatic at the same time, so yeah, we'll look out for more official announcements on that in due course.
Okay.
But we're not, they're obviously, with everything we do at Zebra, we are not leaving developers in the lurch. We are an enterprise company, and we commit to supporting APIs and solutions. So we're not like some other companies who will just, surprise, we've removed that feature, it no longer works, you have to change everything you're doing. We recognize that every time we do remove anything, we come up with a plan and a route forward for developers that lasts several years. So developers can properly plan the removal and the updates to their applications required.
Yeah, that is correct, Darren. I think Luis is looking for some more information about voice in DataEdge. What do you recommend?
So we had a previous developer talk back in like last year, I think it was, where Kathy, one of our Tech Docs leaders, went over the full capabilities of voice input in DataEdge. I also had a sample app available, so we can point the question we can point the person asking the question to those resources. I think would be the best solution, Stacey.
Okay. Okay, one last question here from Matthew. How to propose supporting KKLM with the latest version of EMDK, or not to support it?
So what we do, when we release a new version of EMDK, we support the current letter release, or number release, isn't it now, of Android, and then 2 previous. I think if you have KitKat or L, then you have like a mixed deployment. The best solution that I have come up with, and I've written articles about this in the past, is to have different flavors of your application. So you have a flavor of your app which uses the older EMDK jar file, and that will work with KitKat and Lollipop, for example, and then you have a newer version of the app that works with Android Oreo and Nougat and Marshmallow. That uses the newer jar file, and you just toggle whichever flavor you're outputting. That's to get official support. Often it will probably just work on those older devices, but it's not something we've tested and validated. Like the difficulty is we've got so many different operating systems and SKUs and letter releases and devices that it's not possible for us to thoroughly test everything. But I mentioned earlier on this common platform, often things will just work on older devices because everything's pretty much running on the same underlying platform layer.
Okay, I think that wraps this up for today. And we'll, again, post this to the dev portal where you saw the blog about the DevTalk, and we'll have the presentation and embedded into that blog. And you can post questions there as well for Darren. So I thank you, Darren. This was excellent information. Thank you, everybody, for attending. And we'll look forward to seeing everybody in the new year in January. Happy holidays to everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, Stacey. Happy holidays.